You remember exactly how it felt. The weight of it, lighter than you expected. Almost nothing. A pressure so small you weren't sure at first it was real. And then it was unmistakably real. A bird, on you, choosing you as a surface, as a perch, as a place to be. Maybe it was your hand while you were holding seeds so still you had stopped breathing. Maybe it was your shoulder while you were sitting quietly in the yard. Maybe it was your foot while you were standing at the feeder, and you looked down and it looked up, and for one moment neither of you moved and the whole morning held its breath. You have replayed that moment, because something about it felt significant in a way you couldn't fully name, not just surprising, something deeper, something that felt, if you are honest about it, like a kind of choosing. And you have wondered, what was actually going through that bird's mind when it landed on you? Today I'm going to tell you, specifically, because what researchers have documented about what happens inside a bird in that moment is more extraordinary than most people have ever been told. Welcome back to Backyard Bird Mind. Subscribe before you go, because what you are about to learn about that moment you've been carrying will reframe it completely. Let's begin. What landing on something actually means to a bird. Birds do not land randomly. This seems obvious when you say it, but its implications are larger than most people realize. Every surface a bird chooses to land on has been assessed. Not slowly, not consciously in the way we recognize as decision-making, but in the extraordinarily rapid, multivariable threat calculation that runs continuously beneath every moment of a bird's existence. Before a bird lands anywhere, a branch, a fence post, a feeder edge, it has evaluated that surface for stability, safety, proximity to escape routes, and the cost-benefit calculation of being at that specific location versus any other available to it. A bird that lands on you has run that exact same calculation and arrived at the conclusion that you are worth landing on. Research on avian landing behavior has established that landing on a novel surface, something outside the bird's established repertoire of known perch sites, involves a measurably elevated period of pre-landing assessment. The bird approaches, retreats, approaches again, hovers at the threshold of the decision. What it is doing in those moments is not hesitation in the human sense. It is data collection. It is running every available variable through a survival filter that has been refined across millions of years of evolution. When it finally lands, when it commits, that is not an accident. That is a conclusion. You were the conclusion. The neurological moment of contact, in the fraction of a second that a bird's feet make contact with your skin or your clothing, something specific happens inside the bird's brain that researchers have only recently begun to map with precision. The bird's nervous system floods with threat assessment data from multiple simultaneous channels. The tactile sensors in its feet register the surface, its texture, its temperature, its stability, its movement or stillness. The visual system continues scanning the environment for danger. The auditory system remains open to alarm signals from other birds nearby. All of this happens in under a second, and then something remarkable follows. If the data coming in across all those channels is consistent with safety, if you are still, if you are warm, if you are not producing threat signals, if the environment around you is quiet, the bird's stress hormone levels, which spiked in anticipation of landing, begin to drop. Research on corticosterone levels in wild birds during novel surface contact has found that in birds with prior positive human exposure, the stress spike associated with landing on a human is significantly lower and resolves significantly faster than in birds without that exposure. The familiar human produces a physiological response in the landing bird that is measurably calmer than an unfamiliar one. In other words, if that bird had seen you before, if it had been in your yard, if it had learned anything about you across previous mornings, the moment of landing on you was less frightening than landing on a stranger would have been. Your history with that bird existed inside its body, and in the moment of contact, that history made the difference. What the bird was thinking, translated. I want to be precise here, because this is where the science and the human interpretation of the science can drift apart if we are not careful. Birds do not think in language. They do not have an internal monologue running through the decision to land on you. What they have is something researchers describe as a continuous behavioral state assessment, a real-time evaluation of the current situation against stored experiential data. What was going through the bird's mind when it landed on you was not a thought in any form we would recognize. It was a state, and that state, translated into the closest human language available, sounds something like this. This surface is stable. This presence is known. The threat level is low. The cost of being here is acceptable. I will stay. That is the cognitive content of the moment. Stated plainly, it sounds underwhelming, but sit with what it actually means. A prey animal, a creature whose survival depends on correct threat assessment every single moment of its life, evaluated you and found you acceptable, found you stable, found you known, found the cost of being near you worth paying. Research on chickadee risk assessment during human contact events found that individual birds with established yard familiarity showed behavioral indicators of what researchers cautiously term positive valence states during and immediately following voluntary human contact. Not neutral states, not simply the absence of alarm. States that the bird's behavior, relaxed posture, continued vocalization, absence of escape preparation, suggest were experienced as something other than merely tolerable. The bird that landed on you was not simply calculating that you were safe. It was, in the only way its biology allows, registering that being near you was something it had actively chosen. Why that specific bird chose that specific moment. People often ask why, of all the mornings, all the times they stood at the feeder, the landing happened on that particular day. The answer lies in a concept researchers call threshold accumulation. Trust in birds does not build in a straight line. It does not increase by equal increments with each positive encounter. It builds in layers, unevenly, and it tips, suddenly and completely, when enough accumulated positive experience reaches a specific internal threshold that researchers have not yet been able to precisely locate or predict. Below that threshold, the bird keeps its distance, feeds near you but not from you, watches but does not approach. The calculation consistently produces the same result, not yet. And then one morning, without anything obviously different about that morning, without any dramatic gesture on your part, without any deliberate invitation, the threshold tips, and the bird lands. What changed was not the morning. What changed was the accumulated weight of every morning before it. Every time you moved slowly, every time you refilled the feeder without sudden gestures, every time you sat quietly and let the yard be the yard, every time you were simply present, consistently, without demanding anything from the birds in return. All of that built toward the moment. And the moment arrived when enough of it had stacked up inside the bird's experiential model of you to tip the calculation from not yet to now. You did not earn that landing on the day it happened. You earned it across every ordinary morning that came before it. Dr. John Marsluff at the University of Washington, whose long-term research on corvid-human relationships has produced some of the most significant findings in this field, has noted that the moment wild birds make voluntary physical contact with a specific human represents the endpoint of a trust-building process that is invisible in its accumulation and unmistakable in its arrival. You could not have predicted it. You could not have forced it. You could only have made it possible. And you did. What happened in the bird's brain? After it landed, I saved this for last because it is the finding that changes everything. Most people focus on the moment a bird lands, the contact itself, the weight, the stillness, the held breath. But what researchers studying avian neurochemistry have found about what happens in the seconds and minutes after voluntary human contact, specifically in birds with established human familiarity, is something that reframes the entire experience. In socially bonded birds, positive physical contact with a trusted individual triggers the release of oxytocin, the same neurochemical associated in mammals, including humans, with bonding, with attachment, with the experience of warmth toward another individual. For years, oxytocin was considered a mammalian phenomenon, a human and primate bonding mechanism, something that did not apply to birds. That assumption was wrong. Research published in the journal Hormones and Behavior confirmed the presence of oxytocin-equivalent neurochemical responses in birds during positive social contact events. Responses that parallel in their behavioral effects what oxytocin produces in bonded mammals. Reduce stress, increase social orientation toward the contact individual, behavioral indicators of what the research cautiously terms positive affective state. The bird that landed on you and stayed, that held its position on your hand or your shoulder while you barely breathed, was not simply tolerating the contact. Its brain was producing a neurochemical response to that contact that the science now tells us is functionally analogous to what happens in your brain when you are near someone you feel safe with. The bird was not indifferent to landing on you. The bird felt something, not in the language of human emotion, not with the complexity of human attachment, but in the real, measurable, neurochemically documented way that its biology allows. And in the seconds after it landed, in those extraordinary still seconds where neither of you moved, you were both in your entirely different ways in the presence of something that registered as more than ordinary. You felt it. You knew it was different. You have remembered it ever since. Now you know. So did the bird. I have one question before you go, and I want every single answer. Has a bird ever landed on you? Where were you? What bird was it? And what did you do in the moment? Did you hold still? Did you breathe? Did you feel like if you moved even slightly, the whole thing would end? Tell me in the comments, every detail, because this community has shared some of the most extraordinary moments in these comments, and every single one of them deserves to be told. And if you know someone who has had this happen, who has told you about a bird landing on them and not quite known how to explain why it mattered so much, share this with them. Now they will know why it mattered, because it wasn't random. It was never random. It was the end of a process they had been part of without knowing it, and the beginning of something the bird felt too. Thank you for being here at Backyard Bird Mine. I'll see you in the next one.